We'll be starting in just a second as we're getting more people coming in. Great. All right. So thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Mercedes Piedra. I'm one of the directors for the Office for Health Equity, Diversity, Inclusion here at UC Davis. Thank you for showing up to our series as Growing as a Community. We started the series at the beginning of the pandemic because we knew of the importance of staying in community, being proximate to each other, even on a virtual platform. We also provide this, the series so that we can learn about others' experiences in the work that they do across this campus, across the causeway, and in our communities. And so our focus today is growing as a community, moving from ally to advocate. During the deaths of our unarmed African-American population throughout our nation, we thought it was important for us to be able to work together in looking at all of the inequities that are in every system of our nation. As we've heard and we've educated and we know, is that the foundation of our nation has been founded in racism. And so through our series, we're able to talk, dialogue, think, and give us the time to pause out of our busy lives so that we can grow in community and be more of support, more of a voice, and more action toward hopefully eliminating so many of these inequities. Today's guest speakers are Dr. Colleen Sweeney, who is Professor and Vice Chair of Biochemistry, Molecular Medicine for the School of Medicine here at UC Davis Health, and Dr. Ian Kim, Physician with Family and Community Medicine here at UC Davis Health. These two are exemplars of the work that they have done in health equity across our campus and in our communities. And so I would like to welcome them now. Dr. Kim, Dr. Sweeney, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, glad to be here.
I'm glad that you're here. Great. So in the work that we've experienced through our professional, academic, and personal lives, the Office for Health Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at this time of unrest, the social unrest, has really been bombarded, overwhelmed with questions of where people can take action. How can they be advocates? How do they move forward? And so to do so, I believe it's important, and so does Dr. Henry Tan, who has put forth initiatives of anti-racism, not only initiatives, but calls to our departments and community members to enact anti-racism behaviors, beliefs, habits, everything that we're looking at. And so at this point in time, we're looking at what motivates us to undertake this work of anti-racism, health equity for all. And so wanting to spend some time, Dr. Sweeney and Dr. Kim, first to introduce yourselves and then be able to start that conversation. And we'll start with Dr. Sweeney.
Okay, so hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. I am Colleen Sweeney, a professor, as Mercedes mentioned, in the Department of Biochemistry. I've been here for nearly 20 years, and I'm a researcher and a medical educator.
Great. Dr. Kim, can you introduce yourself?
Well, let me first just say that Dr. Sweeney is those things and so much more. So she's been very humble in her introduction, has been a tremendous ally and advocate for the medical students and for, yeah, I think for what's been important for our diversity and inclusion and justice at the medical school and within UC Davis Health. So I just want to acknowledge that. I was a medical student here, and so got to benefit directly from not only her excellent instruction in the classroom, but also seeing her show up with the students at important moments along the way when students were engaged in activism and advocacy work. And then I actually just finished my residency training in family and community medicine, also here at UC Davis. That was just a week and a half ago. So in the midst of a kind of an exciting transition, I'll be going on to work in a community clinic in Yolo County called Communicare. And I also will stick around here to do a little bit of teaching in the medical school with the accelerated primary care track program here called ACE-PC, which I actually was a part of when I was a student. And I'm sort of a weirdo. I had a whole other career in racial and social justice organizations for quite a number of years before coming to medical school here. I was in San Francisco and Oakland doing that work with places like the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights and other places like the Pachamama Alliance. So, so I came to UC Davis in Sacramento in the medical school with kind of an unusual background. And that sort of informs the way I've approached my education and my work now. I'm also kind of a weirdo because I'm from the Deep South. I'm from South Carolina. So grew up as a child of Korean immigrants in the Deep South. And I think that was really formative for me. And I also have an MBA, which is very strange because if my politics are, I don't know, I hesitate to label myself in this forum, but I would say I don't really subscribe to capitalism in many of its forms and features, but I have an MBA, so makes sense of that. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Kim. So in our work as allies and advocates and for our attendees, allyship has been kind of the mode of operation throughout our nation to have folks who want to step up and support anti-racism work. But over the decades and years, we've seen that allyship just wasn't enough. It didn't have enough of a punch of action. And so now in this season of urgency, moving from ally to advocate, the advocate is more action oriented. And so Dr. Sweeney, I'm going to ask you first, your importance of being an advocate with all the work that you've done and seeing the need. Your journey, can you speak a little bit about the journey from ally to advocate for yourself?
Yes, thank you. So for me, I want to make sure that I thank my students. So students like Dr. Kim. You know, it's been said before that learning really should be in both directions. We teach, but we should also learn from our students. So I think that I'm a product of learning from my students. In fact, the Equity Conference that Dr. Kim helped to organize and found, those were some very kind of earth-shattering moments for me when I began to attend those conferences. And so for me, I think, and I can only speak for myself, but being an educator at a medical school and encountering students who are passionate about every aspect of a patient's life, for the first time in my life, I began to think about things like social determinants of health and health inequity, and being around my students and caring about what my students cared about. So really getting to know my students as a whole person and understanding what's important to them, rather than just coming to the classroom, delivering the material, and then, you know, rushing out the door. It's really my students that have brought me to this. And so that's what really lit the spark in my journey. And then the students have provided so many opportunities for me to go deeper. The Health Equity Conference, the White Coats for Black Lives demonstrations, the candlelit dinner held every year by the SNMA. So my students have really been my driving force in my growth, and I just want to express my deepest gratitude for that. But then beyond my students, once I sort of had that foundation, I began to look around, and I understood that the people who were going to be formative in my journey they didn't necessarily have the same training as me, or maybe they weren't in the same department as me. So I began to look beyond kind of the silo of my own department, and came across wonderful people like Dr. Jan Murray Garcia, who, you know, I can't say enough about her, how, what a wonderful educator she's been. So really it started with my students. It started with wanting to form that relationship with my students. And it's been eye-opening for me.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Jan Marie Garcia is faculty with both the School of Medicine and the School of Nursing here at UC Davis Health. She is co-author of Cultural Humility, and she also is supporting our office through anti-racism training for our faculty. We can't say enough about her influence for our students and our system as a whole and our community with her work of anti-racism. So thank you for bringing up her name. Dr. Kim, we're going to move to you on your work from moving from an ally to an advocate. Dr. Sweeney definitely made mention of your health equity conference that you started as a student. Can you speak a little more about that also?
I can try to. Let me just first say that, you know, Dr. Sweeney and I, with you, Mercedes, you know, we spoke a couple of days ago in preparation for this, and I think Dr. Sweeney and I both were sort of like, wow, why am I the one who's talking about this topic? There are so many other people who are part of UC Davis Health who I would choose first to speak about this, other than myself. So, and I want to say in particular that at a time when structural racism and police violence is so acute and being felt so severely across the country, as a Korean American dude, I just really want to be humble about speaking about advocacy at this moment. There are a lot of different forms of leadership. Sometimes leadership looks like being out front and being the one talking. And sometimes leadership looks like actually listening and promoting and encouraging the voices of others and lifting up the leadership of others. And so so when I think about advocacy work, I think it's important to be just to be aware of all these important dynamics about lifting up voices and leadership of those who are most impacted or who are most directly at the center of the issues at hand. Like I said, I was involved in a lot of activist work before medical school. And so honestly, for me, in my medical training, engaging in advocacy work is a way for me just to be me. It's part of what feeds me, is to, like, I feel like I need to be involved in work that is making some change at more of a systemic level, while I have been in this training, learning how to be a care provider for patients at an individual level. And to be sure, as a physician, as healthcare providers, or being part of a team of healthcare providers, we are advocates for our patients every day. You know, in my training in primary care, I'm advocating for my patients all the time, talking to an insurance company about why a patient needs a particular scan, or talking with a specialist to try to get that referral into a specialist a little bit faster or something, you know? And so if we think of advocacy in that way, it just means stepping up and taking ownership, and being willing to take the extra step in what we feel responsible for and what we feel connected to. So just in the same way that after I place a referral to a specialist, I don't always just let it go and just say, well, that's going to take care of itself. You know, I'm going to pay attention and make sure that that patient gets to the specialist in a timely and appropriate way. In just the same way, when it comes to social justice issues, I feel responsible for being involved in a more active way and following through. Where does that come from? Oh, gosh, I mean, I was, I was a really sensitive, shy kid growing up in the very kind of racially divided black and white rural South Carolina. I think that experience was really formative for me, always feeling some sense of dislocation, always trying to figure out where do I belong, and also seeing how my family struggled with the same questions of how to be safe and belong. And so I think that has just always informed my approach about how can I ensure more safety and more belonging and more dignity for everyone who's around me and everyone in society. So that's maybe the short answer to why I care as a human being in the first place. And yeah, you asked about the Health Equity Conference. When I was a medical student here starting in 2014, it wasn't just me. It wasn't just me. I mean, the way our medical school recruits students through a pretty amazing admissions process, there are every year many medical students who are very, very passionate about social justice issues, about increasing safety and dignity and belonging for more and more people. And so I really just linked arms with many other medical students to say, hey, we've got some student-run clinics, and that's great. And we have some student interest groups, and that's great. But it seems like there could be more connections with the amazing community-led advocacy work that's out in Sacramento, that's outside the walls of this little ivory tower here. And so we just said, why don't we very humbly just reach out to the leaders of organizations that we are interested in, and then invite them in to tell us about their work and how we, as healthcare providers in training, can be better allies and advocates for that work that they're doing. Let us learn how we can promote those voices and those leadership, those examples of leadership. So that's a little bit about the Health Equity Conference, and it's been neat to see that that's continued to happen every year at the medical school since I moved on from there.
Absolutely, Dr. Kim. And can you just outline a few of the topics and that the Health Equity Conference offered?
Oh gosh, so much. I mean, we have the conference, has a different set of topics and flavors every year. But we've certainly talked about structural racism and trauma-informed care. We've certainly talked about sex work and the vulnerabilities of sex workers. We've certainly talked about domestic violence and intimate partner violence, and the organizations that are leading and providing support to survivors of that type of violence. We've talked about substance use and harm reduction. Harm reduction services just across the street from our campus has always been a really strong partner in all of this work. The list just goes on and on. So, the gender clinic in Sacramento is something that I think we should all be proud of in our connections with UC Davis Health to that very important set of services in that community. And the gender clinic's been a really strong part of the conference, I think, multiple years. So, so lots of things, because in healthcare, we have contact with everyone, and so we need to learn about all these different walks of life, right? And before too much more time goes by, let me just say my pronouns are he, him. I'm okay with they, them as well. And that's something that I think many of us are learning to practice to say as we're introducing ourselves to create more space for others.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Kim. What's important about the Health Equity Conference is now every cohort of our medical students and School of Nursing students will plan this event every year, and it's open to everyone at the health system campus and also our community members. So this is a conference that we can all partake in, that lifelong learning that is needed. As Dr. Kim was outlining, he's been living this, he's breathing it, he does it in his work, but it's lifelong learning. It's not something that we just one and done. It's something that we continually work out, and we have this beautiful conference right here at our campus that everyone can partake in. And the topics are varied because there is so much work to be done. In addition to the topics that Dr. Kim outlined, once again, we get to see the disproportionate inequities within all of those areas of our marginalized populations. So thank you, Dr. Kim. Dr. Sweeney, we're going to move to you and your work around your advocacy. So if you could take some time to discuss that with us, that would be wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah, so my focus really is as an educator and doing my very best to create equity in the classroom, to create a positive learning environment, a safe learning environment, and how do we do those things as educators? And I think that being a first generation college graduate and having throughout my journey experiences of feeling out of place, feeling that I didn't quite belong, I have carried that through for better or for worse. There's probably imposter syndrome still brewing today, but for better or for worse, I think it's made me more sensitive to the classroom environment and wanting to do everything that I can to make a safe and welcoming environment. And so how do we do that as educators? It really goes beyond the material that we're delivering. We obviously have to be very efficient and organized in delivering content, but students also need to be able to trust us and feel safe with us and approach us after and spend time with us. If they're having any difficulty with material, if you don't create that safety, they won't come to you. And then what have you really accomplished as an educator? So I think that mostly I've invested time and effort in understanding my students, what's important to them inside the classroom and outside of the classroom, and forming genuine relationships with them, and then showing up for things. So understanding what's important, being inspired by them, and then showing up in person. Using my body to show up to an event that students care about and that I've learned about and I'm inspired by. So it's mostly, I hope, and it's I learn every day, but I hope I'm creating a more equitable classroom environment by creating that safety. Beyond that, I've been fortunate to work with my colleague, Dr. Piedra, to serve as a facilitator for training faculty when they are about to be on a search committee. So when we look for new faculty, it's extremely important that the people that are on the search committee understand, at the very least, what implicit bias is and how that bias impacts the search process. And so I serve as a co-facilitator along with Dr. Chada, but she and I fully believe that we need to go beyond this very kind of 101 type of training and get more into anti-racism, which is a verb. It's a verb. So that's one thing I'd like to say. Advocacy is a verb, just like compassion. Compassion is a verb. Advocacy is a verb. Being an anti-racist is a verb. It takes action.
Thank you, Dr. Sweeney. In addition to when we had met, you were sharing some of your life experiences and those of your loved ones in the part of the country that you grew up, and some of the history of our nation and what your findings were. Can you elaborate on that a little more?
Yeah, so one of the quotes that I really kind of sunk into my soul was from James Baldwin, the poet James Baldwin, who said, white people are trapped in a history that they don't understand. And at least for my generation, I'm here to say I wasn't taught the whole story when it comes to the history of our country. It was a very one-sided kind of perspective. You know, you finish high school, you go to college, you are very focused on pursuing your career. You put your head down, you get through it, and then one day you wake up and you look around and you realize that there's so much more to know. There's a lot of unlearning that has to happen in relearning, and I feel like I'll run out of time. Honestly, I don't know if I have enough time left in my life to really learn all the things that I should have been taught as a human being. Mm-hmm. Just my own personal experience. So I grew up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is not that far from Plymouth Rock, which is where the Pilgrims landed. And so a lot of the history that we learned was teaching us to be proud of the fact that we live close to Plymouth Rock without at all talking about what was done to the indigenous people of our country. So very one-sided perspective. And then I was talking to my husband, and he was never taught about the Tulsa massacre. So yeah, there's a lot of unlearning and a lot of to do, and I think that it's part of growing as a human. It's essential to really understand where we're at.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel any sense of loss because you were robbed from that history?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a great way to describe it. I often ask myself why, but then we know the answer. We know why. But yeah, it's a profound sense of loss, and it's an urgency for, I urgently want to know the truth. I think one of the most important motivating things is a sense of curiosity. That's probably why I'm a scientist. I'm curious. I like to know how things work. And to think that at this age, I can look back and understand that I never understood how it worked. And I had such a blind spot that I wasn't curious enough until much too late in my life. And so curiosity led me to science, and curiosity is going to keep me digging and expanding my knowledge and hopefully growing as a person. But yeah, it is a sense of loss. But I'm alive. I can learn. I can use what I learned to be a better advocate. It's a verb. Advocacy is a verb.
Thank you, Dr. Sweeney. It really is important to reflect on how racism robs everyone. It consistently robs our marginalized communities, but we all lose in this. And so just wanting to have folks just sit with that a little bit, because we have to feel and not just, go through life unaffected by it, but having this time to pause and feel the loss that we all have had because of the way our structures are founded in racism. So, Dr. Kim, after hearing Dr. Sweeney talk about the loss that has affected her in her work, do you have any reflections on that loss for our society, for yourself, for our communities?
Wow, that's a big question. Let me, before I answer that directly or try to, Dr. Sweeney, actually, instead of saying Dr. Kim and Dr. Sweeney, can we just use first names?
Sure, Colleen,
Yeah.
Ian.
Yeah, let's kind of break down some of these things that might kind of hold us apart, even create that little extra space with the word doctor, because I think we're talking as human beings right now. And for sure, we take responsibility for the roles that we have and the training that we have. But yeah, but Colleen, when I hear, it's actually weird for me to call you Colleen because you were my professor before, but we're going to go for it. One of the things that I've always appreciated about you too is not just your curiosity as a scientist, but also your willingness to place yourself in uncomfortable situations, to tolerate being uncomfortable with harsh realities. You stand for me as such an example of having an enormous capacity for compassion and feeling a great deal empathetically when you are thinking and encountering other people. And that extends to animals too. I know how much compassion you have for your pets and around the issue of animal cruelty as well. I just want to mention that because I think that's a part of who you are too. But and I think that's a key part of what we all, for those of us who carry privilege in certain ways, that we all have to be willing to hold our feet to the fire and place ourselves in uncomfortable situations, just kind of sit with things that are uncomfortable. And yeah, there is no question in my mind that if we're talking about racism specifically, because I think this applies to all forms of oppression, that while African Americans and Black people certainly lose the most or experience the worst kind of violence as a result of racism, that we all lose a part of ourselves. Like, I actually think the exercise of compassion becomes blunted or lost when we participate in racist systems, because it is very difficult for us as human beings to accept that we could be participating or part of something that is causing a lot of harm and pain and trauma, and so I think when we cut ourselves off from those realities, we're actually cutting ourselves off from a part of ourselves. So I think we lose in that way. And I don't know, this is such a big conversation. I think rather than meander, I think I'll just stop there. I'm a bit humbled by this question. And I know there are many allies who are on the call right now. So I bet there's a lot more that others could add to this response, but let me just stop there.
Thank you, Ian. And so we're also going to open up for questions in the chat box for those who have are guided to ask any questions. We won't get to all of them, but we'll try to fit at least one or two in. And so moving forward, we talked about the violence that racism plagues our society, specifically for our marginalized groups, specifically for our African American folks. And so how do we consistently work at this for ourselves? What do we do? I believe for many of us, it's part of our work, it's part of who we are, but how do we stay informed? How do we stay in the understanding and consistently work at the compassion that needs to be in the forefront of the work that we do? And I'll leave it up to Colleen or Ian whenever you're ready.
If I could just say, like, I'm part of the family and community medicine department here at UC Davis, and I think when we are part of structures that are hierarchical, as academic medicine is, and I'm okay with that, then it really is important for leaders within the hierarchy to be explicit and to take leadership around these issues. And I'm actually pretty grateful that the chair of our department, Tony Durant, has made really a timely and unequivocal statements against structural racism in the weeks that followed George Floyd's death, and in the midst of kind of the height of the protest that followed, and really made a statement about the role that we as healthcare providers have in standing and acting against structural racism. I didn't think that I didn't expect to get a statement like that from the chair of the department, and I was actually surprised at how much it meant to me to have a leader within the department make that statement. And similar kinds of explicit statements of empathy and political outrage have come from, you know, the program directors of our residency program as well, which was important for me to hear as a resident in training. And then most recently, our department has taken an extra step, and the faculty, I'm gonna sort of hold the role of resident that I just left, because this was happening while I was a resident in my last month, but the faculty actually met and talked about what can we do as a group here in improving our commitment to anti-racism and taking next steps in developing ourselves and providing pathways for development for the residents in training. And one of the first baby steps of that, which I'm sharing because I actually think it's a really cool set of tools, and I would suggest that anyone could do this, is there's a set of 21-day challenges, 3-week challenges that that somebody put together. And I'm gonna, if I can find, I'm gonna actually paste a link. There's somebody named Professor Eddie Moore on the East Coast who came up with 3 different 21-day challenges as a way of building habits and as a way of incorporating actually into our daily lives practices and work around anti-racism. So you'll actually see that on that website there are 3 different options for a 21-day challenge. One is about habit building. So for those of us who might be earlier in our exploration of structural racism and in our role in structural racism, then there's a challenge kind of for that for people who might find that useful. There's another one that's around protest and rebellion. So if we're already engaged in activist work, then how do we deepen that work? And then I really appreciate there's a third one that's about self-care. So there's a 21-day self-challenge for those people who are deep in the work. And I see this in the Black community leaders in Sacramento, that they are holding so much and also deeply exhausted. And if you listen to the Black medical students here at UC Davis and read the statement from SNMA that they just issued about White Coats for Black Lives a few weeks ago, the very first words in that statement is, "We are tired." Because the daily experience of racism, which is something that as a person of color, I have my own experiences of that, but I don't think that I can ever truly understand what it means to be Black in this country. But what we are hearing and what I see is a deep level of exhaustion and burden. And so there's a third challenge, which is about self-care for people who are feeling burned out. And you don't have to be Black to feel burned out. I think there's a way that we all actually feel kind of burned out, and when in the compassion fatigue that we can experience. So there's some beautiful practices there. So I appreciate my department for offering this and challenging all of us to participate in this, to build our habits and change our behavior and take care of ourselves. And I just want to forward that along because I think it's a really neat thing for any of us individually to do. So there was more to the question, Mercedes, but I don't remember what the other aspects were, so I'll just stop there.
That's fine. That was wonderful, Dr. Kim. And we had a comment in the chat box of your remark stating racism causes pain to our marginalized groups. And it's not only pain, it's trauma. And so we need to also own, as a community, that we are traumatizing marginalized groups with the structures of racism throughout all of our society. As Ian was outlining, being Black in our society is beyond exhausting, just to live, just to breathe, just like George Floyd, he couldn't breathe, to sleep like Breonna Taylor, to run as Aubrey was trying to run and exercise. And those are just the basics that for many of us with privilege, and when we talk about privilege, we talk about what we have that others don't. And so making sure that we have that information, and everyone can do a Google search for family medicine at UC Davis Health, and you'll see Dr. Durant's call to action, in addition to an entire 3 pages of anti-racism resources that anyone can link into. And then anything that anyone is passionate about, if you're passionate about working with kids or food insecurity or whatever you're passionate about, always look at how is this affecting marginalized groups. And that would be a call to action for our community to look at what we're already passionate about and look specifically on how it affects African American, Black people, Latinos, Asian American, and everyone else that is ousted from our communities. So, Colleen.
Let me just add to, because I don't want to sound too much like just a simple cheerleader for my department.
No.
We have work to do, like any team of people would. So, so I don't think that I think the reason why it's important to share that the department is taking these steps is because we're not the shining example on the hill, that there is work for us to do to increase our diversity and inclusion in the department, that there is work to do for getting better at this. Mm-hmm. So, and what I appreciate about the department is that that the leaders in the department are taking the steps just to be humble about that. I mean, Dr. Durant, as a white, I think straight identified male, it would be really easy for him just to turn the other way and to not pay attention to it. And he's really taking some leadership at a time when it's really necessary. So, and there's some real humility there that I see.
Absolutely.
So I'm not trying to brag. I'm actually really pointing at, like, we all have work to do, and here's a group that's very humbly trying to do this too.
Absolutely. And Ian, I believe also that leaders step up and challenge. And so for the Department of Family Medicine to be able to put those resources, it's that action component that Colleen was saying. These are actions that we can take. And yes, the work is massive, but the fact that our leaders are stepping up to show and lead and provide, it's not just for family medicine, we're providing for the community these resources so we can all do the work as a community, so we can all grow stronger, so that we can hopefully eradicate some of these inequities. Thank you, Ian. Colleen, just wanting to reach out, you had also some relevant current work that you are doing, and we have some slides that we can show at this time if you're ready.
Yeah, before we show the slide, I would like to just make the comment that science is far behind medicine. And I think we need to acknowledge that. So medical school has clinical faculty, but we also have, of course, the basic science faculty and the basic science departments. And at least in my experience, these are not discussions that we're having in science. It's beginning to happen in the field as a whole. We're becoming more aware of the lack of diversity, equity, inclusion in science, but we've got much further to go than medicine does. And so one of the things that I've always done as a scientist is to keep up on the literature, right? That's what we have to do. We have to, look to see who's publishing in our field. And so something I incorporate into my professional view of myself is not only do I need to keep up in my discipline, but I need to keep up with this. I need to be current. I need to know what's going on, because how am I going to be a good educator and a good example if I'm not as up to date on this as I am on my specific my professional life. There is a slide that's very helpful for me in understanding privilege. So when we talk about privilege, oftentimes white people will have this reaction of, but I'm not privileged because I've had this or this or this happen in my life. And so, yes, that's true. You may have had some very difficult things to overcome. Even so, that white privilege persists. And looking at it from this intersectional point of view, so I think it's the next slide. This one, yes. So this really, when I look at this, it sinks in. So when we look at all the different ways in which somebody can be privileged or they sort of the dominant class. So for example, you may be a white male, but there may be something else that you as part of your personhood that makes you less privileged. But despite that, your white privilege persists. So I hope this is useful, a useful tool in thinking, and will help you to work through that kind of defensive mechanism that will kick in and say, but, cause you to say, but I'm not privileged. Mm-hmm. Like Ian said, we need to exercise that muscle of being uncomfortable and to sit in those uncomfortable spaces.
Extremely important to stay uncomfortable. It's in the uncomfortable that we get to learn, that keeps us humble and keeps us learning. So thank you, Colleen, for that. And we'll have those slides and our resources when we send out the survey. In addition to, Ian has a few YouTube links that Sarah has put in the chat box for us to hear from Bryan Stevenson, who wrote the book Just Mercy, which was also made into a movie, I believe, a year or two ago. There's also added resources from our attendees. So please look at those resources as the community comes together to educate ourselves, to learn, and continue this work.
Yeah, I just wanted to just take a moment and talk about Bryan Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative, because he was a keynote speaker at the AAMC conference last year, and I was blown away by the stories that he told. So there's a link that you'll see to a YouTube video of him talking. It's very similar to the talk that he gave at AAMC, but it's to the Skoll Foundation. So he's speaking to a group of philanthropists, and he's got a, if you will, a prescription, like a 4-point recommendation for how we make change in society. And just very briefly, the 4 elements of that are to get proximate, to choose to place ourselves and to be in connection with those who are most harmed and most directly impacted by injustice. And in his work, it was around people who are on death row. A lot of his work has been around advocating to save the lives of people who are on death row and who are unjustly accused in particular. Taking too long to say this. So get proximate. 2 is to change the narrative, to recognize that there are structural narratives in place that maintain the structural forms of oppression that exist. So we got to change the narrative to change the structure. 3 is to stay hopeful. And 4 is, as we've been saying, to be willing to be uncomfortable. I really recommend the video that Sarah with tech support posted a little bit farther up in the comments. And there's a link to an article too, that's an interview with Bryan Stevenson. And let me just say, like, oh my gosh, the opportunities and the needs to get involved right now are just historic. And mainstream media are really not doing enough to, I think, build our collective awareness of the many struggles that people are facing right now. So there's so many opportunities and needs to get involved if we just scratch the surface and look around. And I bet people here on this Zoom could all point to many things that they're seeing and probably are involved in. But just like off the top of my head, earlier today I was just brainstorming, like, we need to get people out of jails and prisons where like COVID outbreaks are just happening. And, you know, people, anyway, we need to release people from immigrant detention centers. We need to defund the police. We need to maintain access to basic healthcare for undocumented people in Sacramento County. These are all things that are like not just philosophical things, but actual work on the ground that's being done right now that deserves and needs more support and involvement by more people. And, you know, 2.5 months ago, a Rancho Cordova police officer brutalized a 14-year-old boy, and thank God that this boy Jod wasn't killed by the police officer, but was caught on video and viewed by millions. And that police officer still has a badge and still has a gun and still has a job and shouldn't, despite community voices speaking out against that. So just another very local example of advocacy work that really requires involvement. And, you know, when it comes to like childcare and education, like, how do we go back to work when we don't have childcare and education in place for our children to go to schools? That's enormous. We are just beginning to grapple with that. So the list goes on and on and on. You know, undocumented communities have very little support at a time when they've lost their jobs and their ability to take care of their families. How are we taking care of that in society? So it's not hard to get involved at this point, and there's no shortage of need. I think there's a shortage of ways that people are organized to respond to this. And so I think part of the work we have to do is to figure out where are the places that are organized, what's their capacity, how do we add to that capacity in a humble way and in a way that that increases our collective ability to do more with and for each other. None of us is going to get through this period of history unchanged. You know, let's be able to look back at this moment and say that we did what we could, so that the way that we changed was in a noble way. The way that we changed was in a way that we can be proud of.
I love that, Ian. That's beautiful. We just have the chat full of resources and recommendations. And so community, we are growing together with the information that we're going to lean on each other with. So with that being said, in these last few minutes, Ian, I just loved what you just outlined. The need is great, and there are so many ways to be involved and be able to work in the needs of our humanity. So we know that our nation has been grounded. The DNA is in racism and genocide. And so we know that we're making up lost time. And so the legacy of terror that we've put on our marginalized groups has got to change. But we also need to be able to tell the truth, taking advantage that this time is where we get to do the truth telling and the work that we need to instill the justice for our humanity. So thank you so much for your time being here. Ian, Colleen, thank you again for all of your hard work, and we'll continue to walk this walk of justice as a community for UC Davis Health and the communities we serve. Thank you all for attending, and we will see you again next month with our guest speakers from the health system and beyond. Thank you again. Have a good day.
It's great to do this with you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Colleen.